Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, and I look forward to bringing you today's episode about some of the literary influences in the first few Dark Shadows storylines. And this is going to be a bit of a continuing series I'm going to be doing where I look at some of those influences on the show. But before we get to that, I have some news. First of all, when I read the list of Rondo Award nominees a couple of episodes back, I somehow did not see the name of the wonderful John Logan on the list. I talked about past podcast guests who've been nominated for Rondos this year, and John was nominated for the Best Article category, and the article is Hammer and Wheatley by John Logan, Classic Monsters of the Movies, number 34, How Hammer Handled Three Works by Dennis Wheatley, The Devil Rides Out, Lost Continent, and To the Devil a Daughter. So consider giving Mr. John Logan a vote in that category. Sadly, some unfortunate news here. Sad news. Dark Shadows cameraman Stuart Goodman has passed away at the age of 93. Catherine Lee Scott posted about this, as did the Dark Shadows news page. And this comes from the Dark Shadows news page. Stuart Goodman began his career at ABC as a staff cameraman, worked on Dark Shadows, the network's sports broadcast, and he later went on to produce documentary and unscripted programming and continued to develop projects into his senior years. Stuart executive produced several films for A&E Biography and collaborated with Catherine Lee Scott on a documentary adaptation of her Playboy Club nonfiction book. So very sad. And Stuart Manning of the Dark Shadows news page posted a great photo of Stuart during camera rehearsals at the first Dark Shadows studio in June 1966. So sad news. My condolences to Mr. Goodman's family and friends. And other news, the Dark Shadows commemorative coin that was going to be coming out for the 60th anniversary has been canceled, and those who pre-ordered are getting refunds on those. I think it was a combination of the cost of silver going up and also the number of pre-orders that didn't justify the rising cost of silver. It didn't work out. So as I understand it, people are getting refunds on that. So no commemorative coin happening for the 60th. Last but not least, speaking of the 60th anniversary, be sure to grab your tickets for the Dark Shadows 60th anniversary event or convention or festival or whatever you want to call it. I know I'm going to call it a good time because I'm looking forward to that. Lisa Richards has been added to the guest list, who played Sabrina Stewart and her parallel time counterpart as well. So Lisa Richards is going to be there. She is super cool, and I'm excited that she's going to be there. And I'm excited to be there as well, and I hope you will be there if you can make it. So that's going to be happening July 31st, August 1st, and August 2nd. Tickets are available via Eventbrite, and I will post a link in the show notes to that.
Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead.
So I've wanted to dive into this for a little while now. I often talk about this topic when I have guests on, particularly guests who are fans of the Gothic, fans of Gothic horror, Gothic romance, of the horror genre in general. And we talk a lot about the influences on Dark Shadows, the components that make up Dark Shadows. And the reason I've been wanting to do this episode, and I'm certainly not going to single anyone out or be specific here, but I was having a conversation once with a Dark Shadows fan, and I referenced one of the major works that was used in the storyline of Dark Shadows. And the person kind of wrinkled their nose, and they were completely uninterested. And I said, well, that is this storyline in Dark Shadows. Do you like that storyline? And they said, yeah, but they didn't care for the subject matter that influenced it. And I found that somewhat perplexing, because Dark Shadows would not exist if it were not for those things. I think it's important to look at Dark Shadows in context. Please go listen to my Dark Shadows is Wicked Gothic episode. that I did. I'll put a link even in the show notes to that, because I think these episodes that I'm going to be doing about the shadows behind the shadows, these are tied into that Dark Shadows is Wicked Gothic episode. I want to start with an image of the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea is fed by more rivers than any other sea. There are over 130 rivers flowing into it. Dark Shadows is the Caspian Sea. And all of these literary and cinematic influences are the rivers that feed the Caspian Sea of Dark Shadows. Calling Dark Shadows a soap opera is like calling a Victorian cathedral a house. It ignores the architecture of the soul that built it. The serialized nature of the show and the building the characters over the course of those 5 years. The structure of it, I suppose you could compare to other soap operas, the fact that it's serialized. But I tend to think of it more as the serialized Gothics of the 19th century. And by the way, that is not meant as a knock to other daytime soap operas by any means. I have nothing but admiration for the people that put on soap operas, the few that are left. It's such an intense amount of work to create one of those on a daily basis. It's more that I tend to look at the content of the show and what they were going for with that show, especially knowing that Dan Curtis had no particular interest in creating a soap opera, but he did have an interest in the terror and fantasy genre. He liked that. So that's what I'm looking at it more as in terms of the content of the show, but it's certainly not meant as a knock before anybody writes me a nasty email about that. I used to watch All My Children. I used to like it, but to me it was just so different from Dark Shadows. And in fact, as I've said before, I did not even know Dark Shadows was meant to be a soap opera until I was probably in my teens when I read it in a fanzine. And I said, oh, really? Because my uncle also did not know Dark Shadows was a soap opera. He had just come to America from Portugal. And here's this creepy show on TV. But anyway, I just want to clarify that that is not meant in a derogatory way. I recognize that, yes, technically Dark Shadows is classified as a soap opera in television history, I suppose, but it's just so unique and so distinct that I don't really even think of it that way. And having a background and an interest in the Gothic horror, classic horror cinema too, that's kind of where my strange brain tends to live. We have to enter into the cobwebbed mausoleum and look at the roots of our favorite supernatural show. Dark Shadows was a voracious consumer of plots. The writers were working at a breakneck pace, and they were pulling directly from the masters, short stories, novels, theater, films, themselves, of course. You're watching 200 years of ghost stories, Gothic romances, and silver screen terror. Unless you've been chained up in a coffin for 200 years, you know Dracula was used, you know Frankenstein was used, you know the Wolfman film was used, you know Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Turn of the Screw. All of these influences found their way. Plot threads, plot ideas. Sometimes it was just a scene. Sometimes it was just a moment, an inspiration. But sometimes it was an entire storyline that they would lift beats from and even scenes from that particular story. I know one fan infamously wrote a letter and referred to the Dark Shadows writer's room as a den of thieves because they were swiping all these classic literature plots. But Dark Shadows reimagined them in their own unique way and, of course, created their own stuff too. I think most Dark Shadows fans like spooky stuff. And I talked before about that Dark Shadows leans way more into terror than horror. What's hiding in the shadows waiting to pounce. You don't know what's there hiding in the cobwebs until it finally does pounce. And there is horror in Dark Shadows too. The TV series is much more universal, and the House of Dark Shadows is much more Hammer. That's what I always say. And I love both Universal and Hammer, great Gothic horror classics. And there is some Hammer stuff in Dark Shadows too that was worked in, moments and bits and pieces here and there. And certainly Universal stuff is worked in. Overall, the whole Gothic aesthetic of Dark Shadows was pulled from all of those great novels, starting with The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, and then just going right on down the list. All of those characteristics were established long before Dark Shadows came along, but they very expertly used those, and they knew how to create that mood and that Gothic atmosphere. And Dan Curtis telling the writers, okay, read this. Now, I'm going to just hit the first few storylines in this installment. I was going to do them all, but that became just way too much. So I'm going to do this over a period of time. It might take me months to get around to the next one. I don't know if people even want to hear this. So let's start right at the beginning with Victoria Winter's arrival, search for her parentage, and the revenge of Burke Devlin, and we'll roll in the Bill Malloy murder plot with that. That's part of the Burke Devlin's revenge storyline anyway. It's a component of that storyline. And the two major literary threads running through that first storyline, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. And there are a couple other major things in the mix, which I will talk about in a second. And Jane Eyre, as I said, was written by Charlotte Bronte, published in 1847. And Jane Eyre is a classic Gothic romance following an orphaned and principled governess who goes to work at Thornfield Hall. She goes to work for the brooding Mr. Rochester, who has a dark secret locked in a room. The story will be revisited in the 1897 storyline with Jenny Collins as the analog for said secret, the Mad Bertha Rochester, and Rachel Drummond taking on the Jane Eyre role. But in this instance, we have Victoria Winters in the Jane Eyre role. And then The Count of Monte Cristo, Alexandre Dumas, was published between 1844 and 1846 after being falsely imprisoned for 14 years. Edmond Dantes escapes, acquires a vast fortune, and meticulously orchestrates revenge against the men who betrayed him. Dark Shadows didn't only use classic Gothic horror and Gothic romance stories in its mix. It used other things too. So The Count of Monte Cristo is an adventure novel and a work of historical fiction. It was first published in serial form between 1844 and 1846. Like many of the stories that are used in Dark Shadows, they were serialized initially before they were compiled and published as a novel. It's a quintessential example of 19th century French literature, often associated with the Romantic period, which is characterized by strong emotions, drama, and adventure. But those aren't the only two things used in that early part of Dark Shadows. The supernatural romantic horror film The Uninvited from 1944, directed by Lewis Allen. It's widely considered to be the first Hollywood film to treat the subject of ghosts seriously. The film is based on Dorothy McCardle's novel Uneasy Freehold, published in 1941, and it was published in the United States as The Uninvited in 1942. The Uninvited, it's a great movie if you haven't seen it. It combines Gothic horror with a romantic mystery. A brother and sister purchase and inhabit a cliffside mansion by the sea, only to discover it is haunted by two distinct spirits connected to a tragic family past. One of the spirits is a mysterious and sad female ghost, accompanied by the scent of lilacs, accompanied by the smell of mimosa, which is a key sensory indicator of a ghostly presence. It signals the manifestation of the good spirit, Mary Meredith, and often accompanied by intense cold wailing and the wilting of flowers in the house. So the brother and sister are living in this mansion by the sea on a cliff, very Roger and Elizabeth. And then we have this sad female spirit who's accompanied by this scent of a flowery perfume, Josette's ghost. I mean, if you watch The Uninvited, it's uncanny. A lot of Dark Shadows vibes to The Uninvited, which I certainly encourage you to watch. It's a really cool movie. And in fact, later in the Laura the Phoenix storyline, Dr. Peter Guthrie even makes a reference to it. There's a nod to it because they're going to have a seance, and Laura asks him who will be there, and Dr. Guthrie replies, "There will be those who are invited, and of course, those who are the uninvited." So that was kind of fun. And don't worry, I have not forgotten where the Elizabeth storyline came from. I'll get to that in a little bit. The Bad Seed, 1954 horror novel by William March, and the classic 1956 film directed by Mervyn Leroy. So the 1966 incarnation of David Collins features distinct similarities to the psychopathic child Rhoda Penmark. The Bad Seed was adapted into a Broadway play in 1954, and then, as I mentioned, the popular film in 1956. It's a psychological thriller about a mother's horrifying realization that her outwardly perfect angelic 8-year-old daughter is actually a remorseless monster. David isn't as bad as Rhoda Penmark. You can't get much worse than Rhoda Penmark. She's really bad. She is a bad seed, but David is also a bad seed. Clearly, I think the character of David was inspired by Rhoda Penmark. It's a boy in Dark Shadows, but he is not nearly as bad as Rhoda Penmark, but he displays a lot of her traits, particularly in those early months of the show. He uses his outward appearance of innocence to mask a very troubled nature and sometimes monstrous, cruel behavior. He really knows how to play people. He can be very manipulative and using the fact that he's a child to play on people's sympathies, but then he will do really terrible things like lock Victoria Winters in a room in Collinwood and leave her there, to die. Basically, he is cut from the same cloth as Rhoda Penmark. I mean, it's not a dead-on adaptation, certainly. None of these that I mentioned are dead-on adaptations. Most of the time, that's not the case, but there are certainly a lot of elements of all 4 of these in those storylines running concurrently. Burke Devlin's revenge and Victoria Winter's arrival and search for her parentage. Those 2 things are happening side by side. And Dark Shadows does that sometimes. Several of these storylines, they'll take 2 major, it might be a literary story in a film, or it might be it might be a novel and a film, or 2 novels, and they will have them running concurrently side by side. And then they will usually meet somewhere as well. Then we move on to the next storyline, Laura the Phoenix. This one comes from mythology primarily. This is probably the most unique thing Dark Shadows did as far as supernatural characters go. They reimagined the Phoenix. So this comes, as I said, from mythology. The Phoenix is a legendary immortal bird that cyclically regenerates or is otherwise born again. Originating in Greek mythology, it has analogs in many cultures such as Egyptian and Persian mythology. Associated with the sun, a phoenix obtains new life by rising from the ashes of its predecessor. They took the idea of this bird, of this mythological bird, and reimagined it as a humanoid creature in human form, one of the living dead, somebody who is reborn like the phoenix, but is it in the form of a person, not in the form of a bird. Which is really ingenious. It's just such a cool, Malcolm Mormestein came up with this concept, and it was such a cool, unique idea. It's also possible that elements of H. Rider Haggard's 1887 novel She was an inspiration, and that was also made into a Hammer film, by the way. H. Rider Haggard's She is a seminal work primarily classified as an adventure novel. It's also an example of Imperial Gothic romance, a 19th century genre blending adventure, horror, and romance to express anxiety about the British Empire. It combines exotic lost world exploration with themes of supernatural immortality and forbidden passion. The story features magical elements, including an eternal flame and an immortal queen, Aisha, who possesses supernatural powers. This one is not dead on. I get the vibe there's a little bit of She in the mix there with the Phoenix stuff. I could be wrong, but I'm not the first person to suggest that. Several people have posited that was a possibility. I wouldn't put money on it, but I think it was in the mix there. And of course, during the Laura storyline, the Count of Monte Cristo storyline with Burke Devlin continues through that as well, and will get resolved before Barnabas shows up. Now we're heading toward Barnabas, again, running concurrently with Barnabas, but starting just before Barnabas comes along is The Blackmailing of Elizabeth by Jason McGuire. So it's The Blackmailing of Elizabeth and the Introduction of Barnabas Collins. So now we're looking, again, 2 major things, 2 major stories happening at the same time. The Jason McGuire blackmail plot is The House from 1954, which was written by Art Wallace, who wrote the Dark Shadows Story Bible and also was a writer on the show for a while at the beginning. The House was the basis for the Elizabeth as Recluse and Jason McGuire blackmail plot, and for the characters of Elizabeth, Carolyn, and Jason. An original script written by Art Wallace, The House first appeared on the CBS anthology television series The Web in 1954. Wallace used the story again for the NBC TV series The Goodyear Playhouse in 1957. The dramas on the earlier show, The Web, were all adaptations of stories written by members of the Mystery Writers of America, and the series won an Edgar Allan Poe Award. So Art Wallace used his own story, his own script that he had written, and that had been done on television earlier in 1954, and then again in 1957, he repurposed that and used it as, again, another foundational element in Dark Shadows. So The House, and then we got the introduction of Barnabas Collins as this House storyline is happening. Then comes Barnabas. And I think it kind of goes without saying here that the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker in 1897, and also the Universal film Dracula in 1931, directed by Todd Browning and starring Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula, a vampire nobleman who emigrates from Transylvania to England and preys upon the blood of living victims, including a young man's fiancée. He moves into Carfax Abbey near Dr. Seward's asylum, which is similar to Barnabas moving into the old house near Collinwood. He has a thrall, Renfield, who does his bidding. Maggie Evans is the Lucy Westerna analog. Joe is her suitor, Arthur Holmwood. Mina Harker is Victoria. Dr. Woodard is Dr. Seward. They were setting up Dr. Hoffman as Van Helsing, supposedly, but they changed gears. But later on, you are going to get Van Helsing with Professor Stokes, who comes onto the show. We get our Van Helsing, who a sage occult scholar who knows a lot about the supernatural, but is also an academic. Professor Van Helsing was the mold for Professor Stokes. But similar to Count Dracula moving to London, Barnabas returns to Collinwood after nearly 200 years, posing as a cousin from England. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a second. And his insinuation into society, using charm in his aristocratic bearing to enter the homes of the living to prey upon them. And so many elements of Dracula have become synonymous with vampire lore, but a lot of that found its way into Dark Shadows. The wolves, the dogs howling and stuff. That's the animals being unsettled in the presence of the vampire when he's out and about, because he's an unnatural being. So that's why the dogs howl when Barnabas is around. That comes out of Dracula too. The Dracula's powers, turning into a bat, being able to repel with the cross. All of this, a lot of that stuff comes from Dracula. But it's not only Dracula. Obviously, there are certainly predecessors to Dracula. The aristocratic vampire, Lord Ruthven, and John Polidori's The Vampire, right? That's where that came from, that aristocratic type of vampire. These are creatures from folklore, right? Vampires were not strictly a literary creation. Obviously, they're creatures from folklore. People believed in vampires. There are still people who believe in vampires. They're folklore. For a lot of the things in Dark Shadows are a lot of these supernatural creatures, werewolves, for example, witches. All of this stuff there's a lot of folklore that comes into play. But I'm looking at some of these literary sources here, and Varney the Vampire, which a lot of similarities to Dark Shadows and how it's serialized. It's an ongoing story. He is the first sympathetic vampire, Varney the Vampire, by John Malcolm Rymer, 1847, serialized story, predates Dracula by decades. And again, the first sympathetic vampire. But I doubt Dan Curtis and the writers from Dark Shadows read Varney the Vampire. I'm gonna just say that, put that out there. I really doubt they read Varney the Vampire. It has 232 chapters, 876 double-columned pages. Altogether, it totals nearly 667,000 words. I'm gonna go ahead and say that they did not read Varney the Vampire. I don't even know if they knew what Varney the Vampire was. Maybe they did. If anybody in that group knew what Varney the Vampire was, it was Curtis, Dan Curtis, or Art Wallace. And Art Wallace was not involved in the creation of Barnabas, despite what he said at one time. He was long gone by the time Barnabas came along. Regardless, even though Dan Curtis was a fan of the genre, I still have my doubts as to whether he would even be aware of Varney the Vampire, if that would have been on his radar or anybody else's radar. That seems unlikely to me, although there are some striking similarities as far as the structure, some of the elements that also found their way into vampire lore, and the fact that he's a sympathetic vampire. There are other ingredients. Another universal horror classic, The Mummy from 1932, directed by Karl Freund, starring Boris Karloff as Ardith Bey. Imhotep the Mummy, an ancient Egyptian high priest, buried alive for trying to resurrect his lover, Princess Ankhesenamun. Ardith soon discovers Helen Grosvenor, a half-Egyptian woman bearing a striking resemblance to the princess. Ardith falls in love with her, believing her to be the princess's reincarnation. He attempts to make her his immortal bride by killing, mummifying, and resurrecting her. So the whole Barnabas kidnapping Maggie Evans, her resemblance to Josette, and him trying to recreate Josette, his long-lost love, that's the Mummy. So they took Dracula and combined Dracula with the Mummy. And later, we're going to get a big old heaping dose of Larry Talbot, the Wolfman, in there too, when we find out that Barnabas is under a curse. That is infused into Barnabas, mirroring the tragic, fated aspects of that classic Gothic horror monster as well. So Barnabas, a very Byronic figure. And then continuing on here, as part of this Introduction of Barnabas storyline, as we go through, we're going to meet Dr. Julia Hoffman. If we look at Dr. Julia Hoffman and her attempt to cure Barnabas of his vampirism, we have to look at the inspiration for that. I think it has to be Universal's House of Dracula from 1945, directed by Earl C. Kenton. In House of Dracula, Dr. Franz Edelmann attempts to cure Count Dracula, who is using the alias Baron Latos. He's played by John Carradine at this point in the franchise. This is the last, before they do Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein and Lugosi comes back. This is the last of the horror cycle, I would say. Although the monsters play it straight in Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, it is a horror comedy, but the monsters are not being comedic at all. They're just being themselves. Bud and Lou are being the comedians in that. But anyway, getting back to this, Dr. Franz Edelman attempts to cure Count Dracula of his vampirism. Dracula requests the cure, claiming to be weary of his curse. He says, "It is a curse of misery and horror against which I am powerless to fight alone." That sounds so much like Barnabas, right? Dr. Edelman tells Dracula that vampire blood contains an unknown form of parasite, and he believes that he can treat it via a vaccine and transfusions. Lawrence Talbot, incidentally, the Wolfman, also goes to him looking for a cure for his lycanthropy. So the idea of Dr. Julia Hoffman trying to cure Barnabas of his vampirism and seeing it as some kind of strange blood disease that she can figure out, that very much echoes House of Dracula. And it's funny, I've seen people say that was a very unique thing that Dark Shadows came up with. Sorry, it is unique that the doctor who's trying to cure the vampire falls in love with the vampire. That did not happen, as far as I know, in House of Dracula. In fact, it does not go very well for Dr. Edelman in House of Dracula. So I mentioned some inspirations are just one scene, one moment. One of those comes in episode 361, the Julia episode, when she sees that pulsing door in her bedroom as Barnabas is tormenting her with all of these supernatural manifestations. That is a direct nod to the 1963 film The Haunting, which is an adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And that scene is in The Haunting, where you see this pulsing door effect. And they adapted it to videotape for Dark Shadows for their special effects that they were able to do, but that is directly where that came from. Now, the last thing, and I referenced this a little bit earlier, Return of Dracula from 1958, directed by Paul Londres. The way Barnabas insinuates himself into the modern-day Collins family parallels this film, in which a vampire arrives and insinuates himself into a family as a lost cousin from Europe. The way even he wears his overcoat over his shoulders like a cape is very reminiscent of Barnabas's Inverness cape. And the ending, by the way, and Ansel Farage pointed this out when we talked about House of Dark Shadows, the ending of that, and spoilers, if you haven't seen Return of Dracula, where Dracula is impaled is echoed at the end of House of Dark Shadows. It's similar vibe there. I'm guessing that somebody in that writers group, whether it was Dan Curtis or one of the other writers, probably was Dan Curtis, saw Return of Dracula and maybe tossed that in. Now, I don't know for sure about Return of Dracula. I can't say with 100% certainty that Return of Dracula was used in the DNA of Dark Shadows, but I'm pretty sure that the whole idea of the cousin thing, it's possible they just came to that organically. It just kind of makes sense, right? I mean, he looks like the painting. He's a long-lost relative. Oh, here's cousin Barnabas. Maybe. But there are definitely some echoes of Return of Dracula, I would say, in that mix. So I think I'm going to stop it there. But I just wanted to cover some of these major. I didn't want to dive too deep in. I did do an episode with Steve Schutt and Amanda Desiree on The Dreamers, which is the novel that inspired The Dream Curse. A lot of people didn't know that. They thought that The Dream Curse was the only original plot Dark Shadows ever did. Sorry, I got news for you. It's not. It's The Dreamers by Roger Manvell. And Ron Sprout actually flat out said so at the first Dark Shadows Festival. He explained that that's where that came from, and we did a whole episode where we talked about the novel and compared it to the storyline. So I'm going to stop it there. I've rambled on quite a bit here about talking about these different inspirations, these different rivers that fed the Caspian Sea that is Dark Shadows. I wanted to just help get the idea out that Dark Shadows is a library of the world's most unsettling literature and cinema. And I hope to do more of these. I think it's important to appreciate all of that stuff because it'll help enrich your appreciation of Dark Shadows. Although it might be a while before I get to the next set of storylines and looking at the inspirations. If you're jonesing to see more and can't wait until that happens, I recommend taking a look at the Dark Shadows fandom wiki. There's a section called List of Works Used in Dark Shadows. There's also a great article that was written by Ansel Farage for the first issue of Daytime Gothic. Hey, I would really appreciate it if you haven't done so already, if you could rate the podcast. So Apple Podcasts and Spotify in particular are very important. So if you give it a rating, and or a review. I would appreciate it. And also, I'm trying to build up the YouTube for the show. This particular episode is an audio episode, but I did put up some pictures and stuff. Please give the podcast a like if you enjoyed the episode. Please also give it a subscription as well on the YouTube channel. Also, if you want to support the podcast financially, it does help me to pay for the Adobe software that I use to edit the podcast. It helps pay for the Squarespace web hosting for all the episodes. You can do that by donating at Buy Me a Coffee. I'll put a link in the show notes as always, and also TeePublic, where there are Terror at Collinwood t-shirts, Shilling Shockers t-shirts, all kinds of other fun tchotchkes like coffee mugs, things like that. So thank you in advance to everyone who has contributed to the Buy Me a Coffee, who has purchased shirts and other items at the TeePublic, and thank you in advance to those of you who do plan to do so. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate your listenership. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, hello, my dreary one. It's been a while, hasn't it? Yes, it's your old pal, Penny Dreadful. I've been up here in the attic for a while now, playing the Green Ghost board game against myself, and I just can't seem to win. Anyway, I want to let you know that they're finally letting me out of the attic. The spell has been broken, and I shall be unleashed this year in 2026. I'll be coming to Monster Expo as a guest. Once again, I don't know what they were thinking asking me to go back there, but I will be in Scare Haven, Massachusetts this April. The date's on your screen because I can't remember that. I'm 700 years old. Don't expect me to remember that. And don't expect me to remember your name either. I won't. I won't remember. I refuse to remember. Even you, William. Even you. And of course, I'll also be at Monsterama in August out in Atlanta. Won't that be fun? So come and see me in Atlanta. And in the interim, since this year, we released our first episode of Shilling Shockers back in 2006, January 1st, in fact, the new year of fear. And perhaps this year we'll be seeing some more Shilling Shockers, or perhaps something else. We shall see. Anyway, my dreary one, I hope you're doing terribly, because I know I am, and have an excellent evening, or day, whenever you happen to be watching this.
Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.